All right. So October was first declared as the National Domestic Violence Awareness Month in 1989. And before that, it had only been a day. But since then, October has been a time to acknowledge domestic violence and survivors and be a voice for its victims. Domestic violence is prevalent in every community and it affects everybody, regardless of age, race, socioeconomic status, religion, height, weight. It doesn't matter. Anyone can be a victim or a perpetrator. And physical violence is often accompanied by emotionally abusive and controlling behavior as part of a much larger systematic pattern of dominance and control. Domestic violence can result in physical injury, psychological trauma, and even death. The devastating consequences of DV, domestic violence, can cross generations. It can be generational trauma and it can last a lifetime. Although there's been a lot of progress in reducing DV, an average of 20 people are physically abused by an intimate partner every minute. This means more than 10 million abuse victims annually. That's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men that have been abused by an intimate partner. And 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men have been severely physically abused by an intimate partner. Millions of Americans live daily in silent fear of in their own homes. And every year, millions of children are exposed to domestic violence. DV incidents affect every person within a home and can have long-lasting negative effects on children's emotional well-being and social and academic functioning. And that's from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So we can imagine why this one day of DVAM went to an entire month. Um, this work is vitally important. We interrupt cycles of abuse and make people and their children's lives immeasurably better. And we all help save lives. It's very intense work. And the people who stay and do it do so out of passion. So, what is domestic violence? It is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. It includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, economic and emotional/psychological abuse. The frequency and severity of domestic violence varies dramatically. And statistics in North Carolina, 35% of North Carolinian women and 30% of North Carolinian men experienced intimate partner physical violence. That's called IPV, intimate partner physical violence, and intimate sexual violence or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. That's nearly a third of all Carolinians experiencing interpersonal, physical, or emotional violence or stalking. 3/4 of North Carolina's domestic violence programs serve 1,152 survivors and their children in a single day in 2020. 569 survivors and their children found refuge in emergency shelters or transitional housing provided by local domestic violence programs. And another 57 requests for services went unmet due to lack of resources. In North Carolina in 2020, there were 91 intimate partner homicides and 355 active protective orders in the NICS index. Again, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the US have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. And when abusers have access to guns, that increases the risk of intimate partner femicide, which is the killing of women, approximately 1,000%. Access to guns increases the death of women by 1,000%. Um, yeah, so when guns have been used in the most severe abusive incident, the risk increase even more. So, what does domestic violence look like? This is the wheel of power and control. It was created to illustrate the cyclical nature of domestic violence, although this isn't an exact portrayal of an order or anything. Any one or more of these things can be happening at any time. But domestic violence typically looks like a person being neutral or even excessively kind and loving, which we call love bombing. They may, throw a lot of love and affectionate behaviors at the person. Then things will reach some sort of head, and these behaviors on this wheel are enacted. The behaviors may culminate in physical abuse or they may not. But central to all of this is a system of power and control by which the abuser dominates the victim to keep them from leaving the relationship. Economic abuse. This was on the wheel. Economic abuse involves maintaining control over financial resources. A lot of people don't think about domestic violence as being financial, but it absolutely can be. So people can withhold access to money or attempt to prevent a victim from working or attending school in an effort to create financial dependence as a means of control. Victims and survivors are often forced to choose between staying in the abusive relationship and poverty or homelessness. Economic abuse is a very common reason why victims stay in a relationship. It can take a lot of forms. It can look like employment related abuse, which prevents the victim from earning money by preventing them from going to work, sabotaging a person's employment, interfering with a person's work performance through harassing, like frequent phone calls or frequent visits, um, preventing the person from looking for job interviews or attending job interviews. And then there's coerced debt, which refers to the non-consensual credit-related transactions in the context of an abusive relationship. That means applying for credit cards, obtaining loans, or opening other accounts in the person's name, forcing that person to take out loans, forcing the person to sign financial documents, or using threats to or physical force to convince the person to make transactions, money related transactions. They might refinance a home mortgage or a car loan without the person's permission or knowledge. And abusers can also prevent people from accessing existing funds by deciding when and how a victim can use cash, bank accounts, and credit cards. Forcing the person to give the abuser money, ATM cards, or credit cards are another form of violence and control. So, emotional or psychological abuse. They are terms that are often used interchangeably, and it involves trauma to the victim caused by verbal abuse, acts of threats, threats of acts, or coercive tactics. The perpetrators might use emotional or psychological abuse to control, terrorize, or denigrate their victims. They may put their victims down, and it frequently occurs before or along with physical and sexual abuse. Emotional and psychological abuse includes humiliation, controlling what the person can and cannot do, withholding information, deliberately doing something to make the person feel diminished, less than, or embarrassed, isolating the person from friends and family, denying the person access to money or basic resources, stalking, putting the person down in public or private, undermining the victim's confidence or sense of self-worth, and on and on. And the This abuse creates the trauma uh, that can cause long-term damage to the victim's mental health. And these symptoms can include depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal ideation, low self-esteem, difficulty trusting others, and more. Subtle emotional psychological abuse is often more harmful than either overt emotional or psychological abuse or direct aggression. Sometimes it can be very, very subtle, like gaslighting. We'll talk more about that. There are multiple other forms of abuse and violence, and the Wheel of Power highlights a lot of them. There are unfortunately as many forms of abuse, isolation, intimidation, stalking, cyberbullying, as a person can think of. Rape intersects with domestic violence, and nearly half of what we call acquaintance rape, that is a rape that happens between two people who know one another, nearly half of those women are married to their rapist, and nearly a third of men are married to their rapist. We don't have statistics on non-binary, trans, or queer people who are married, but we can assume that they are at least similar. And with chronic underreporting, who knows what the actual statistics are? 60% of female identified stalking victims and 44% of male identified stalking victims reporting this being a current or former partner. Children and domestic violence. According to the NCADV, and that's the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year, and 90% of these kids are eyewitness to this violence. We'll discuss some of these things further on as we get into the impact of DV on marginalized communities. But you can imagine the impacts on children are long lasting and deeply wounding. Domestic violence impacts some communities in even stronger and harsher ways than others. With the intersection of poverty, racism, anti queerness, the redlining and gerrymandering of neighborhoods, casual homophobia, Muslim hating, marginalized communities bear the burden of DV even more heavily. American Indians are 3 times more likely to experience assault than any other ethnic group. Over half of Native women experience intimate partner violence, or IPV, and 66% experience psychological abuse. The rate of murder on reservations can be up to 10 times the national average. And I bring this community up specifically because, of course, not only do they deserve highlighting, but they are such a powerful and heartbreaking example of how generational trauma, lack of resources, combined with high poverty rates, especially on reservations, can exacerbate domestic violence trauma. Alcohol and drug use on tribal lands is rampant and is associated with domestic violence perpetration. On one reservation, 40% of reported violent crimes involved alcohol and drugs, 40% of those crimes. And although the federal government recognizes 566 tribes in the US, there are only 26 shelters nationwide that provide culturally specific services to American Indians or Alaska Native victims or survivors. Blackness, Black people, due to systemic racism, racist policies, and racist societal structures, both Black women and Black men and others experience intimate partner violence at a disproportionately high rate. By intentionally denying Black people access to economic insecurity, to the ability to build intergenerational wealth, healthcare and education, and a sense of safety from governmental systems, racist policies increase the prevalence of risk factors for domestic violence. These systems create a lot of barriers for survivors seeking safety. Law enforcement officials often arrest Black survivors, and police, jurors, and judges are perceived to be less likely to believe Black survivors than white survivors. Racist systems put Black people at higher risk for experiencing IPV, and Black women in particular are at a high risk for gun violence and murder. LGBTQIA plus communities. Within the LGBTQ plus community, transgender people and bisexual women face the most alarming rates of sexual violence. Among both these populations, sexual violence begins early, often during childhood. Partners of LGBTQ plus people may use their privilege and power to out their partner as gay or trans, or however they might identify, as a power move uh, to create trauma and harm to the person they're outing. According to the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of straight women. 22% of bisexual women have been raped by an intimate partner, compared to 9% of heterosexual women. And while this isn't specifically interpersonal violence, I do want to mention that 85% of victim advocates surveyed by NCAVP reported to have worked with an LGBTQ survivor who was denied service because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The 2015 US Transgender Survey found that 1 in 5 respondents who were incarcerated in jail, prison, or juvenile detention in the past year were sexually assaulted by facility staff during that time. And 17% of respondents who stayed at one or more homeless shelters in the past year were sexually assaulted at the shelter because they're transgender. So you might imagine this kind of creates a culture of distrust and an unwillingness to, go to systems to ask for help or aid. In intimate partnerships, LGBTQ plus people are at risk for both physical and psychological abuse because of their status within society at large, which often ignores or worse, harms that community with legal policies. Queer people may struggle with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other health risk factors that contribute to interpersonal violence. And finally, gender violence and domestic violence in rural communities. So about 20% of Americans live in rural communities. Gender-based violence is more prevalent in rural communities than in urban or suburban communities. Injuries from DV are more severe in rural communities than in cities or suburbs. And homicides in rural communities are 3 times as likely to involve an intimate partner than in large cities. Survivors in rural communities face unique barriers to finding and achieving safety, including geographic isolation. A lot of advocates in these communities cite lack of community services and support, like within a 40-mile range. There's isolation from other people, there's lack of transportation, and a longer response time for first responders. And these all contribute to domestic violence. And there's also social and cultural barriers, like rural communities are more likely to adhere to traditional gender roles in which family cohesion is the highest value. That's over the safety of the individual or the victim. And intimate partner violence and sexual assault are seen as normal behavior. Domestic violence and sexual assault are considered to be private or personal or family matters rather than issues of public safety. Women are shamed for reporting domestic violence or sexual assault. Friends of and family members often encourage people to stay in abusive relationships, and survivors seeking services can't remain anonymous. They can't be anonymous because everyone they know works at these places, or the service providers are acquainted with the victims from other settings or socially. There's poor criminal justice response and a lack of trust in impartiality by the criminal justice process. So all these things create a great an enlarged community risk, social risk for domestic violence. With each of these communities, I have named only a few of the barriers they face regarding IPV. Each community clearly has their own unique challenges, but some of them are common. Lack of police interest or response, or perceived lack of police interest or response. Each community might feel that the police have little interest or investment in helping them out. Poverty. This is due to the intersection of racism, homo and transphobia, isolation, and being seen as culturally disposable or less than or not deserving. Excuse me. Social hierarchy, valorizing cisgender white men above everyone else. Shame and a sense of personal responsibility. A lot of survivors of domestic or interpersonal assault feel a strong sense of somehow having caused the situation, a belief that, of course, is bolstered by the perpetrator's gaslighting or psychological abuse, isolation imposed by the perpetrator. And I'm sure that everyone here knows what gaslighting is, but just to, recover that ground, it is when a perpetrator will tell the person that what they believe isn't true. They will make the person feel, they will destabilize the person by saying, no, you didn't see that. I didn't do that. You didn't say that. I didn't say that. Or I said this, and they completely make you feel like you're going crazy. It's very destabilizing. Every community has its unique challenges, and domestic violence does much the same thing to everybody involved. Identifying domestic violence. Inside the relationship, domestic violence can look like the victim being told by the perpetrator, "You are not good enough," or "You never do anything right." They may show extreme jealousy of your friends or even your family about any time spent away from them. They might try to prevent you from spending time with others, especially friends, family, and peers. They might insult or belittle or shame you in front of others. They might prevent you from making your own decisions, like about work or school. They insult your parenting beliefs or skills and threaten to take away or even harm your children or your pets. They could intimidate you with weapons, including kitchen objects or just day-to-day utensils. They destroy your things. They impose a GPS system so they know where you are at all times. They have all your passwords. They have financial control or access to your finances. And these are some of the stages of abuse. It can go around like this. There can be, a love bombing or calmness, and then it goes to an incident, uh, and then there's a reconciliation. So it goes in this kind of circle. Warning signs: jealousy, possessiveness, or refusing to trust, unpredictability and mood swings, threatening, demeaning, and humiliating the victim, and rigid beliefs about gender roles in relationships. Now, sometimes we may ascribe to gender beliefs. We may have strong conventional beliefs around gender roles. That's our choice, and that's fine. But an abuser will use this to dominate the person in all these ways that we have discussed. So it becomes a, kind of a toxic version of normative gender roles. Male victims in IPV. 1 in 4 men have been physically abused, and by that I mean slapped, pushed, or shoved by an intimate partner. 1 in 7 men have been severely physically abused. That's hit with a fist or hard object, kicked. Before I go on with this, I don't think I said in the beginning, this material is really, really rough. And if you find yourself having some kind of response to it, please close your computer and step away and take some deep breaths, reorient yourself in the room, feel where your feet are, and make sure that you're breathing, because there's no reason to re-traumatize or traumatize yourself by, listening to a brunch and learn. It's just not worth it. Many of us have experienced or witnessed these kind of relationships, and it's traumatic. So, back to men. Nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner and have reported at least one measured impact, by which I mean like being fearful, being concerned for their safety, PTSD symptoms, the need for health care, an injury, contacting a crisis hotline, needing housing services, needing victims advocate services, legal services, or missing at least a day at work or school. 1 in 18 men are severely injured by intimate partners in their lifetime or feel humiliated and threatened by a partner's actions. The challenges for men and DV or IPV are somewhat different than the ethnic, racial, and sexual minorities that we talked about earlier. Because while sexual assault and domestic violence is generally underreported, when it happens to men, there are even fewer reports. Men are up against the hegemonic social structures of masculinity versus femininity, and rape is seen as demasculinizing, or it's only supposed to happen to women or gay men. But as you can see by the statistics, it can and does happen to men of all races, ages, orientations, and ethnicities. Men are challenged to report it because they fear ridicule or disbelief, and they fear being seen as gay or weak. The pressures to conform to a self-imposed masculine standard may get in the way of fully seeking the help of professionals or even the comfort of friends. So even asking your friends for help may be difficult. And when it comes to domestic violence in particular, male identified people are supposed to be, the head of the household, the dominant force in the relationship. But nearly half of the men reporting have experienced being kept track of, being insulted or humiliated, threatened by a partner's actions in their lifetimes. And 2 out of 5 men experience some form of coercive control, like isolation from their family and friends, or manipulation, blackmail, threats, economic control, or exploitation. Why do people stay? That is a complicated question, but let's start with the abuser may make it nearly impossible to leave by threats, by withholding the finances, by threatening your children or pets. And most abusers will go to extremes to prevent the person from leaving. The person most fully understands what their abuser is capable of. That means the victim or the person fully understands more than we do, more than any experts, what their abusers are capable of. The abuser may even make death threats to the person or their children or pets. That's really, you know, that's a strong reason to stay. There's other reasons too, like there's fear that the abuser's actions will become worse or even lethal. There might be unsupportive friends or family. The knowledge of the difficulties of single parenting and having less money. The person might feel that the relationship is a mix of good times and love and hope, along with the manipulation and humiliation and fear. The person's lack of knowledge or access to safety and support. There's a fear of losing custody of their kids if they leave or divorce their abuser, and there's a fear that their abuser will hurt or even kill their children. Lack of means to support themselves or their children financially, and lack of access to um, bank accounts, cash, or assets. Maybe they don't have any place to go. There's no friends or family, no money for hotel. The shelter programs may be full or limited by length of stay. There's also religious or cultural beliefs that may not support things like divorce or may dictate outdated gender roles and keep the victim trapped in the relationship. There might be a belief that two-parent households are better for the kids despite the abuse. How to get help. Now, if you are a survivor or a friend of a survivor, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence has tremendous tips for you. This that I have put up on the screen is a help sheet. And if the person is able to hide this information from their abuser, there are questions that help the person strategize about next steps. So here are some of the questions, some of the things that you can fill out. When I have to talk to the abuser, I can fill in the blank. There, I can call any of the following people. So it gives you a place to list all the phone numbers so you can have that at your fingertips. When leaving work, I can, fill in the blank to have some strategies for leaving work safely. And there are, contact information and help that that person might be able to access. Now, this is tricky because if you are in a situation where the abuser is stalking you or watching you on the internet, this may be a very difficult document to access. But if you can access it, it could be a tremendous, tremendous help. And their site has a lot of tips in general. Of course, you can call us. We have a 24/7 helpline. And please don't forget to call us. We have a lot of experts waiting to help and direct you in the best place possible. And also, one of the things that NCADV says is don't be discouraged by rejection. If the person can, try again. If the person's not comfortable with the person they're working with, ask for another. Get a list of possible resources from different places, programs, or organizations. Most states have a free phone service, which is 211, which can connect you with advocates who can help you find additional resources. If you can, have all those important documents with you, like your birth certificate, your picture ID, your driver's license, passport, and utility bills to show residence. Learn what documents you might need ahead of time and make your calls from a place where you can actually talk. Take care of possible interruptions ahead of time, like having the little ones take a nap or call when the children are playing at a neighbor's. Be patient, speak clearly, and maybe don't give your story to the first person who's answered the phone because they may not be the person who's going to help. Um, be very clear about what you need. I need a pro bono family law attorney for a child custody case, and I am a victim of domestic violence. And then let the service provider ask you for what you need to qualify for the services. Here are some cultural barriers to getting help. A victim's fear of being charged with desertion, losing custody of children or joint assets, anxiety about living with less money and options, religious and secular counselors saving a couple's relationship at all costs rather than having the goal of stopping the violence. Lack of support or perceived lack of support by police officers and law enforcement who may treat violence as a domestic dispute instead of a crime where one person is physically attacking the other person. A lot of times people are arrested, victims are arrested and charged by law enforcement, even if they are only defending themselves against the batterer or the abuser. The people talking the victim out of filing charges. Some people may dismiss or downplay the abuse, side with the abuser, or don't take the victim's account seriously. There may be a reluctance by prosecutors to prosecute cases. Some may convince the abuser to plead to a lesser charge, thus further endangering the victim. Judges rarely impose a maximum sentence on convicted abusers. Probation or fines are much more common. Despite having a restraining order, there is little to prevent a released abuser from returning and repeating that violent behavior. Even though there's greater public awareness right now and increased availability of housing for victims who are fleeing from these relationships, there's not enough shelters or shelter space to keep people safe. Here are some religious or cultural reasons that stress that divorce is forbidden. The socialization of some means that they believe they are responsible for making that relationship work. Failure to maintain the relationship equals failure as a person. Can be a deeply embedded and harmful belief. Isolation from friends and families, either by a jealous and possessive abuser or because they feel ashamed of the abuse and try to hide signs from it from the outside world or their families. And that isolation contributes to a sense that there's nowhere to turn. A person might rationalize that their partner's behavior is caused by stress or by alcohol or by problems at work or unemployment or other factors. So the victim could rationalize their abuser's behavior. Societal factors that teach women to believe that their identities and feelings of self-worth are contingent upon getting and keeping a man. There's maybe an inconsistency of abuse, and during nonviolent phases, the abuser might be incredibly charming and romantic or apologetic. So the victim might rationalize the abuser as being basically good until something bad happens, and then they have to let off steam. What do abusers have in common? I mean, you really can't look at one thing or another and point at someone and go, that's an abuser. But there are some commonalities. An abuser often denies the existence or minimizes the seriousness of the violence and its effect on the person or other family members. An abuser objectifies the person and often sees them as being their property or sexual objects. The abuser has low self-esteem and feels powerless or ineffective in the world, and they might be successful, but internally they feel inadequate. The abuser externalizes the causes of their behavior. They might blame their violence on circumstances like stress, their partner's behavior, having a bad day, on alcohol, drugs, or other factors. They might be seen as pleasant and charming, and they might be pleasant and charming between periods of violence, and they're seen as a nice person outside of the relationship. Illustrations of the power and control wheel are particularly helpful tools in understanding the overall pattern of abusive and violent behaviors by abusers to establish and maintain control over their partners, both within and following a relationship. A lot of times, one or more violent incidents are accompanied by an array of other types of abuse, and they're less easily identified, but they firmly establish a pattern of intimidation and control in the relationship. As you can see by this wheel, the abuse is cyclical. There are periods of time where things might be calm, But those times are followed up by a buildup of tension and abuse, and that usually results in the abuser peaking with intensified abuse. The cycle then starts to repeat, commonly becoming more and more intense as time goes on. Of course, every relationship is different, and not every relationship follows the exact pattern. Some abusers may cycle rapidly, and some may take longer, but there often is a consistent pattern that we can see. And regardless, abusers purposefully use all kinds of tactics to instill fear and uh, trauma in their victims to maintain control and keep them at their side. How does abuse affect victims? DV, it affects all aspects of a person's life. When a person is able to safely escape and stay free from their abuser, they often survive with long lasting and sometimes permanent effects to their mental and even physical health, their relationship with friends, family, and children, their career, and their economic well being all may be challenged because of this abuse. Victims of domestic violence also experience a lot of different emotions and feelings about the abuse that was inflicted on them, both in the relationship and after the relationship. They also might resort to extremes in efforts to cope with the abuse. So, a victim of DV might want the abuse to end, but not the relationship. They might feel isolated, depressed, helpless. They might not know what services are available to help them. They could be embarrassed or fear judgment. They might deny or minimize the abuse. They might withdraw emotionally or distance themselves from family or friends. They could be impulsive or aggressive. They might feel financially dependent on their abuser or feel guilt related to the relationship. Shame, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and abuse of alcohol or drugs are very common coping mechanisms or symptoms. They might be hopeful that their abuser will change or stop. They may have religious or cultural or other beliefs that reinforce staying in the relationship. They might have no support from friends or family. They could fear their cultural or societal backlash that might thwart escape or support. They could fear that they have nowhere to go or no ability to get away. They might not be able to support themselves. They may have children in common with their abuser and fear for their safety. They could have pets or other animals that they don't want to leave. They may be distrustful of law enforcement, courts, or all these systems if abuse is revealed. And they may have had unsupportive experience with friends, families, employers, law enforcement, courts, CPS, etc., and believe they won't get help if they leave, or fear retribution, which is a legitimate fear for people who want to leave. They may fear they will lose custody of their kids, for example. All of us, all human beings want love, and we all deserve the best relationship, whether it's with a family or friend or date or partner. For those of us out there who are struggling in ours, there is hope and there is change, but we have to let people help. We have to let people help.